Hello everybody! My name is Rachel and it is time for my 2016 reading statistics, aka my favorite time of year on BookTube because I love crunching the numbers. I try to stay ignorant of my statistics throughout most of the year so I get a really big surprise at the end. This year I will try to directly compare my hard numbers with last year's numbers to determine if there were actually any changes rather than just guessing, because sometimes I am really wrong. There will not be any short fiction statistics this year, even though I was planning on having some numbers for you guys, but I did not track enough data consistently enough to provide any meaningful results, and I will attempt to do better next year. Here we go. In 2016, I read 232 books compared to 243 in 2015. The big difference underlying this number is that I read dozens of short fiction magazine issues and hundreds of short stories, which I did not do in 2015. So I suspect I read far more in 2016 than I did in the previous year, and I'm not really sure how that's possible, but it happened. Onwards to genre. I read 66 science fiction novels, 48 fantasy, 30 young adult, 23 nonfiction, 19 trade comics or graphic novels, 14 collections, 10 mystery novels, 6 middle grade books, and 16 from other categories that include classics, plays, historical fiction, steampunk, literary fiction, memoir, poetry, romance, and supernatural. I used the same genres as last year, but I pulled out collections into its own category. This is because I was reading more like essay collections or short story collections with a variety of material in them, and I felt like I needed to start tracking things like collections rather than putting them into other genre categories. Changes from 2015 include that I read slightly more science fiction and slightly less fantasy. I'm pretty sure that some of those fantasy books got put into the collections or young adult categories though. I read more young adult, but most of those, almost all of those, were YA fantasy rereads. I also read more nonfiction and comics, but significantly fewer classics and mysteries. I guess I'm okay with this mix because it isn't really a big change from the previous year, but I really would like to read more classics and try to read more plays and poetry in 2017. Sources, or where did I get my books? 104 were books that I owned, 101 came from library sources, 12 from Audible, 10 from NetGalley, 4 I borrowed from other people, and 1 I got from Project Gutenberg. I want to drill down into the library category a bit more because this is a category of categories, and I changed a little bit over 2015. In 2015, I counted library as separate from Overdrive, even though Overdrive is a library resource. So this year I put local libraries, Overdrive, and interlibrary loan into that library category. I used interlibrary loan and Overdrive twice as much over the previous year. I read more of my owned books, but I used resources like Project Gutenberg far less. But I am really happy that I used interlibrary loan more frequently because that means I was taking the time to do that rather than buy books, and I have a really bad habit of buying books rather than going through the hoops to get things through interlibrary loan. It's not actually that interlibrary loans are difficult for me to make, it's just that it requires pre-planning, that I make a list of things and I keep to it and I take it to the library with me, and I forget to do that a lot of the time. Now we come to formats, which may be the most boring category because it doesn't change that much from year to year, but nevertheless I continue tracking it. I read 83 trade paperbacks, 71 hardcovers, 33 ebooks, 24 audiobooks, 15 mass market paperbacks, and 6 other, where other is I couldn't really figure out what it was because the size, shape, or what have you was odd. As I said, the big numbers don't change that much from year to year in this category. Trade paperback is still my most preferred and used format, and overall the trade paperback and hardcover numbers didn't change significantly from 2015. I did see a significant increase in ebooks, and I doubled my audiobook usage, which I attribute to the fact that I used Overdrive twice as much, which is really nice. Authors. This is the big honking category that gets a bit complicated, so here we go. I read books by 155 unique authors, and 86 of those authors were new to me, in the sense that this was the first year I read a novel by them. However, this year I excluded some authors, such as Yoon Ha Lee, from my new to me list because I had already read a lot of those authors' short stories, and by the time that I read a novel-length thing by them, I didn't feel like they were really new to me. I had already discovered them. Now, every year I break down gender in two ways, and I find that doing this can reveal two very different stories sometimes. I do unique author gender and then gender by books. And what do I mean by how this can be different? For example, it is completely possible to read more female authors than male authors while reading fewer books by women than by men. And I aim for gender parity in both of these breakdowns. Therefore, of the 155 unique authors I read, 82 or 53% were women, 69 or 44% were men, and 4 were both or unknown. The change from 2015, there's a really big difference here actually. I read 24 more female authors than I did in 2015 and 2 fewer male authors. So basically, I added a bunch of female authors without excluding the men. Of the 232 books that I read, 132 or 57% were by women, 95 or 41% were by men, and 5 were by both or unknown. The changes from the previous year were pretty similar to the other gender breakdown. I read 20 more books by women and 4 fewer books by men. So the upshot of this is that I read more female authors and more books by women than I did in 2015 without noticeably reducing how many male authors or books by men I was reading. I'm pretty heartened by the gender statistics this year because I'm finally seeing a difference. I've been trying so hard to read more books by women and I hadn't seen this number change that much, but it seems like slowly over the years there are these incremental differences that are finally building up. It is hard to get here though. And I'm not saying that I want to read like all books by women or something, but I try to pay attention to science fiction and fantasy by women, and it can be very disheartening when there's no real change by the end of the year, just trying so hard and not seeing a difference. That actually leads me to a little note I want to tack on to the gender breakdown this year, and that is genre and gender. I like to say that I read science fiction by women, but that's not completely true this year. Science fiction and fantasy were my 2 most read genres, but 25 of the science fiction books I read were by women and 41 were by men. And in the fantasy genre, 35 were by women and 13 were by men. I am quite certain that my Hugo and Nebula Award winners project in the last 3 months of the year skewed this number because of those 31 books I had left to read, most of them were science fiction and most of them were by men. And finally, publication year. I like to look at the spread of years over which I have read, and while I didn't pay that much attention to publication years while I was reading this year, I still think it's fun to look back on what happened. So I read books from 1589, which was a Shakespeare play, to 2016. 51% of the books I read were from the 2010s and 24% were from 2016. The average publication year was 1991, but the median was 2011. In 2015, my average publication year was 1985, so you can see that the average year went up, and all the numbers are saying that I just read more newer books this year. This surprised me though, because I felt like for most of the year I was reaching for and reading older books, but it turns out that most of the things I read were from the 1980s and onwards. And that's all I've got for 2016 reading statistics. I did not track author diversity. In fact, I didn't track diversity numbers at all this year. I know that I'm still reading mostly authors from the US. Maybe I'm reading slightly more authors from the UK, but I'm guessing that this number, if I wanted to break down by geography, is still really terrible. Like really, really terrible. once again, is something I will try to work on more in 2017. If you have your own 2016 reading statistics, please let me know, or let me know if you made a video about it, because I love watching those types of videos. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for just a wonderful year on BookTube, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.